Charles Weller is the resident CEO of Deutsche Bank here in Nigeria. He has work experience spanning over 25 years in international payment system. He will talking to Business Incorporated about what the international money transfer market is all about and how Nigeria can benefit, especially now that the central bank says it is time to regulate it in a better way.
The state of the international money transfer market, highly regulated, highly complicated, and a fascinating business area. If we look at the regulation, and I think that's one of the key drivers in the international payments industry, it is becoming stronger and stronger and more relevant to all banks and financial institutions that are active in international money transfers. So one of the key drivers taking us forward is the regulatory side of the business. Having said that, nevertheless, the business is growing considerably in primarily the US dollar and then various other currencies, including Asia and the Chinese yuan.
The central bank has issued a draft guideline on the operation of the international money transfer market, and one of the objectives, according to the Apex Bank, is to provide a minimum standards and requirements for the international transfer services operation in Nigeria. What's your take on this?
This is the guideline that's come out by the Banking and Payments Department, Dipo Fatokon's department. We welcome it. In Nigeria, I welcome this guideline, and it's a very positive first step in bringing in a significant part of the money and payments business into a framework that is regulated and controlled in the financial sector. For example, at the moment, basically, we're talking about the money brokers and the Bureau of Exchanges, the exchange offices, which fall outside of direct central bank regulation and the regulatory environment today. They're a significant portion of international payments in Nigeria, and it's essential that they fall within the regulatory environment. And I'll come on and give you an example in a minute. But at the moment, we've got a very well-regulated banking sector where the international payments, irrespective of currency, are regulated. And then behind that, as a key part of the payments business, however, you've got the money brokers and the exchange offices that are working with the banks. So for me as Deutsche Bank processing payments to or from Nigeria today, if those payments have come through a foreign exchange broker's office, I cannot tell, because we're getting them fed into us through a commercial bank. I can't necessarily tell who the initial customer is. But because of the regulatory environment, as I'm part of that payments flow, I'm obliged to know who the parties are. So bringing them in through this guideline paper will certainly bring in more transparency and more structure and framework into the payments business in Nigeria and then internationally.
If you look at institutions who operate in the industry that's in the money transfer market in Nigeria, how would you describe the level of performance, the level of involvement?
I'd rate them very highly. If we look at the Nigerian financial sector in the dollar payment environment, there are a significant number of Nigerian banks that are right up there along with very well recognized international banks in their payments processing. In fact, we have an annual award, Straight Through Processing Award, which is given to approximately 200 banks globally that have a processing level of 95% and more. And I can say that the winners of this award in Nigeria, and there are 3 of them this year, were at 98+% on their processing success. So it shows you that the technology, the staff, and the whole flow through from A to Z in the payments process, from the time the client makes the payment to the time the beneficiary receives that payment, the Nigerian banks know exactly what they're doing, and they're in there among the top in the world.
Are these financial institutions meeting up with the international standards?
International standards, the benchmark is very high. We're in an environment today where regulation is extremely stringent. We've got, for example, the OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, that is monitoring and checking all of payments. Behind them are the sanctioned countries and the sanction lists. Now we've got FATCA, which is the foreign asset tax regulations that was introduced by Congress in 2010. These are all regulatory, and I'm only talking about the dollar. When we look at other currencies, we have the regulatory environment there too, but the dollar is the main currency, trading currency for Nigeria. These are all regulations that banks involved in the payment world have to be very, very familiar with and compliant with. The other issue that is relevant there is breach of those regulations and or those sanctions today is leading to extremely heavy penalties and fines. Standard Chartered Bank, as an example, paid a fine. Respectively, they did a settlement payment of $300 million for a sanctions breach. Currently, BNP Paribas, there's discussion of a penalty between 10 billion and 16 billion US dollars. So the message there is you cannot be on the wrong side of the regulatory environment in the payments world because the penalties are crippling. That's an area where on the controls, regulation and so on that Deutsche Bank focuses very, very heavily and very carefully on to make sure that we are absolutely compliant.
Now, prior to this period, how would you describe the regulatory framework, the regulatory environment of the money transfer market in Nigeria?
I think if we look at the commercial banks, the money transfer business has been well regulated, is well regulated. The framework is there. The reporting is there, the guidelines are there, and the controls are there at various levels. Some banks have more stringent controls than others. Not saying that those banks with weaker controls are falling short, they're not. But for example, some are totally automated. Others still rely to a certain extent on individual reviews and processing. The area that was outside of the regulations and controls, as we spoke about before, was the FX brokers, the bureau de changes, and the exchange business outside of the commercial banks. And in this country, that makes up a significant portion of international money payments going to or from Nigeria and into Nigeria. So, as I said before, we welcome it, that the central bank is now looking at that area to bring them into a controlled and regulated payments environment.
The Apex Bank says it is concerned with the level of partnership, especially foreign technical partnership, that financial institutions in Nigeria is involved with. Why is this so?
I think the Apex Bank's comment raised a concern. I think you've got the foreign entities, the foreign banks. You're talking mainly Deutsche Bank, you're talking about Citibank, you're talking about Standard Chartered Bank in the payment space that are key currency providers. If I look at Deutsche Bank, for example, this year our payments business in New York, which is the dollar payments business, has had more than a dozen days where they've been over $1 trillion in payments volume going through our systems. So I think it's very much going forward a partnership between the international banks and the indigenous, the Nigerian banks, in the space of international payments that is required to take the business and the transactions to that next level.
The central bank said that it will conduct appropriate due diligence on the promoters of proposed money transfer operators in the country. What's your take on this move?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential that the central bank does undertake those due diligence exercises, because the key factors in when we're dealing with payments today are things like financing of terrorism, money laundering, and similar negative events. It's critical that the central bank has controls, as the Apex Bank, has controls and detailed knowledge of all the parties that are in the money transfer space. Because at the end of the day, Nigeria is a major US dollar counterparty, and Nigeria needs to stay in line and within the American US dollar regulatory environment. And in order to do that, you need to know all the parties in the payment world. For example, we say at Deutsche Bank we have a highway, a payments highway, which is basically our computer systems and software for processing payments. Now, imagine a terrorist driving on a highway. Are you holding the highway liable for that terrorist driving on your road? That's where we are today in the payments world. If there is laundered money or money that is being used to finance terrorism coming through Deutsche Bank's highway, it's Deutsche Bank that's going to get penalized for that. Similarly, the Apex Bank in Nigeria, if they're not regulating and controlling that highway, it will be the commercial banks and the Apex Bank that get are penalized or get the negative press. And at the end of the day, then it's the reputation of Nigeria that's on the line.